She slept beside a doll for 60 years. Every night, in a gray, moated castle north of Brussels, she called it by her husband's name. She talked to it. She had once been an empress. She had crossed an ocean wearing a crown. And the men who took her empire from her did something far crueler than exile. When her husband was executed, they forged his handwriting, a letter in his voice guiding her home, so she would never fully learn how he died. She found out anyway, just not in time to stop wandering. The claims about the forged handwriting, the doll, and the exact length of her waiting require independent historical verification. This is the story of Charlotte of Belgium, Empress Carlota of Mexico, and the one thing 60 years of madness could never take from her. Welcome back to Crown Secrets and Scandals, where we go past the portraits and the titles to the women history preferred to forget. If this is the kind of story you come back for, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs you nothing but a click. There is a castle north of Brussels, moated, gray, easy to walk past without a second look. It belongs to a botanical garden now. School children cross its grounds every spring, probably without knowing what it once held. For 48 years, an old woman lived behind those walls. She had once been addressed as Your Majesty, and she was still called that every single day, right up to the morning she died. The source also describes her as waiting for 60 years, which creates a discrepancy against the 48 years cited elsewhere for her time in this specific castle. Her name was Charlotte of Belgium. In Mexico, they called her Empress Carlota. She was the only daughter of Leopold I, Belgium's first king, raised on diplomacy and languages and the quiet certainty that she had been born to matter. The man she loved was Maximilian, Archduke of Austria, younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph. Napoleon III made him Emperor of Mexico. For 3 short years, Charlotte and Maximilian ruled an empire together. Then it fell. And what happened to her after the fall is the reason this story is so hard to put down once you've heard it. She had been raised to rule. She was intelligent, devout, and ambitious in a century that had almost no use for an ambitious woman. When her world collapsed, she didn't die with it. She spent the next 60 years reigning over nothing at all. Nothing but the inside of her own mind. An empress with no empire. A wife still loving a husband the world had taken from her. Locked inside a silence no one would ever fully explain. She had a mind sharp enough to govern a country, and she lost it in a hotel room in Rome. She was one of the most photographed women of her century, and she lived out her final decade somewhere almost no one was allowed to look. In her worst years, sudden rages could send crystal crashing off the tables and books torn apart in her own hands. But there was one small collection in that castle she never once touched. She guarded it like it was sacred. We will come to it. I promise you, we will come to it. But to understand how a princess ends her life waiting for a husband who is never coming home, we have to go back to a palace called Laeken, and to a little girl who was, for a short golden while, the happiest child in Belgium. The Palace of Laeken sits just outside Brussels. Long windows, formal gardens. A little after 1 in the morning, on the 7th of June, 1840, a daughter was born there to the King of the Belgians. They had waited a long time for her. Her mother's pregnancy had been frightening, and there had been real talk that spring of losing the child. When the baby arrived healthy and crying, Her father was, by every honest account, a little disappointed. He had wanted another son. In Belgium, in those years, a daughter couldn't inherit the throne. Leopold I didn't stay disappointed for long. But there's something you should know about the name he chose, because it tells you almost everything about the man. Years before Belgium even existed, Leopold had married an English princess, Charlotte of Wales, heir to the British throne, the great love of his life. They were married 18 months. She died in childbirth, and their son died with her. Leopold never fully recovered. He remarried, became a king, had other children, but he named his daughter after the dead woman he'd loved first. So the little girl at Laeken carried a ghost inside her own name. She was a memorial before she was a person. It suited her father, distant, careful, melancholy, a man who fled the palace whenever he could. His children felt the absence of him the way children always do. But when he did turn his attention to Charlotte, it was total. She became, without question, his favorite, the one he brought along to watch him work, to sit quietly while kings and ambassadors talked, absorbing the slow art of diplomacy before she was old enough to know that's what she was learning, and she absorbed it well. By early childhood, she could already speak and write in French, English, and German. She read constantly. She thought about God, duty, and what a person owed the world for being born high. And she thought about it with an intensity that unsettled the adults around her. At 15, she'd write that her hunger for learning made ordinary society feel flat and dull. It isn't hard, hearing that now, to see a lonely child handed a dead woman's name and a father's grief, learning to be excellent because excellence was the one thing no one could take from her. Then, when she was 10, the one warm thing in that palace was taken too. Her mother, Louise, had been the gentle one, a French princess who personally oversaw her children's education, their prayers, their small daily comforts. In the autumn of 1850, tuberculosis took her. She was 38. Charlotte was 10. The change was sharp and immediate. The child who'd been boisterous and quick to laugh went quiet. She turned inward, becoming the pensive, careful young woman she'd be for the rest of her life. A French countess was brought in to raise her. Competent, disciplined, cool. But a governess isn't a mother, and a father who flees the palace isn't a father who fills the empty place. The first door had closed. She was 10 years old, and she'd learned the lesson that would shadow her whole life, that the people you love can be taken without warning, and that no crown in the world can stop it. What she had instead was her mind, and her mind was formidable. By 16, Charlotte of Belgium was one of the most sought-after young women in Europe. Beautiful, brilliant, fabulously rich, the only daughter of a reigning king, first cousin to Queen Victoria. The suitors came, and here's the first of the small, terrible ironies running through her whole life. One of those suitors was a king in his own right, Pedro V of Portugal. Both Queen Victoria and her own father wanted the match. Charlotte said no, and listen to how she said it, because these are the words of a girl not yet 17, certain she understood exactly what she was refusing. As for Pedro, it's a throne, true. She'd be queen and majesty. But what is that? The crowns nowadays are heavy burdens, and how one regrets later having yielded to such considerations. The crowns nowadays are heavy burdens. She was warning herself, She couldn't have known how completely. The next suitor wasn't a king at all. He was an Archduke of Austria, 8 years older than she was, not conventionally handsome. But there was something in his charm, his talk of liberty and reform, his easy Habsburg confidence that caught her completely. She met him in May of 1856. By her own account, she made up her mind almost at once. This would be the man she married. His name was Maximilian, and on the far side of everything, the wedding, the palace by the sea, the ocean, the crown, the firing squad, the 60 silent years, he is the reason we're here. Her father wasn't thrilled. He'd wanted the Portuguese king, but he loved his daughter, and he'd always let her think for herself. So he gave his permission. She was 16 years old, standing in a palace in Brussels, certain the way only the very young and the very clever can be, certain that love and intelligence and good intentions would be enough, that the heavy crown she'd turned down in Portugal would somehow sit lighter on her own terms. She had no idea the door she was about to walk through would be the last one anyone opened for her freely. Every door after this, the world would close behind her. One country, one hope, one certainty at a time. The first had shut when her mother died. The next would shut on a wedding day. They married on the 27th of July, 1857, at the Royal Palace of Brussels. She was 17, wearing the confidence of a girl who'd chosen her own future and couldn't imagine it going wrong. We have his side of it too, and it's worth hearing, because it tells you exactly what she was marrying into. Writing to his family about his bride-to-be, Maximilian took her measure like a man appraising a horse. She was short, he noted. He was tall, as it should be. She was dark. He was fair, which was good. And then this. She is very intelligent, which is a bit annoying, but I will undoubtedly get over it. Her intelligence, the thing her father had prized, the thing she'd built her whole self around, was, to the man she adored, a minor inconvenience he expected to tolerate. She either didn't hear it that way or forgave it the way you forgive everything at 17. She'd married for love into the greatest royal house in Europe. Her new mother-in-law, the formidable Archduchess Sophie, adored her on sight. Charming, beautiful, loving, Sophie called her, thanking God for the wife her son had been given. That approval, warm as it was, quietly lit a fire that would burn for years. Because there was another young woman in that family. Sophie's other daughter-in-law, wife of the eldest son, Emperor Franz Joseph. Her name was Elizabeth. History would come to know her as Sisi. Sisi was the beautiful one, the famous one, the one the poems got written about. She was also fragile, unhappy, quietly at war with her domineering mother-in-law. And here came Charlotte, younger, richer, cleverer, the daughter of a reigning king, showered with the very approval Sisi could never earn. The two women disliked each other almost immediately. Sisi's verdict was cutting. Charlotte, she said, was a pretentious little Coburg, forever showing off her learning, forever clinging too tightly to her husband. Charlotte, for her part, thought Sisi came from a family beneath her own and behaved like it. There's a small, cruel story that tells you everything about how cold that court could be. Charlotte had a lapdog, a gift from her cousin Queen Victoria. On a visit to the Habsburgs, one of Sisi's own dogs, a large one, killed it. Charlotte was grief-stricken, told of the death of the little creature that had come from Victoria's own hands. Cece was entirely unmoved. She simply remarked that she'd never cared for small dogs. The precise details and wording of this anecdote are presented as court recollection and should be treated as such. It's a tiny thing, a dead lapdog. But hold on to it, because it's the first glimpse of a pattern that would define Charlotte's life. She kept loving things, and the world around her kept taking them and shrugging. To escape the court's coldness, Maximilian and Charlotte built themselves a refuge. On a rocky spur jutting into the Adriatic near Trieste, they raised a white castle called Miramar, all sea light and marble, a fairy tale made of stone. Maximilian had been made viceroy in northern Italy, and for a while there was purpose in it. Charlotte threw herself into the role, sharp-eyed and tireless. "I can feel the thorns already," she wrote, "but I can also foresee the satisfaction from doing something good." She always saw the thorns. She always reached for the rose anyway. But the post didn't last. Maximilian was too liberal for his brother's taste, too soft on the Italian nationalists, and France stripped him of the position. Austria lost northern Italy soon after, and the couple retreated to their beautiful castle by the sea, with no empire to run and nothing much to do. A clever, restless woman and a dreamy, wandering man, shut up together in a monument to a happiness that was already thinning out, because the marriage behind the marble was going quietly wrong. The details are murky, and we should be honest that they're murky. This is the private life of a 19th century couple, and much of what survives is gossip. But the gossip was consistent. Maximilian, it was whispered, wasn't faithful. There were other women. Some said worse. An illness he may have carried and passed to her. These claims are presented in sources as unconfirmed rumor, not established fact. What's certain is this: they never had a child. Year after year, no heir came. And in a royal marriage, a childless bedroom is never a private matter. It becomes a subject of speculation and blame, most of it landing, as it always did, on the wife. So picture her there, not yet 25, beautiful, brilliant mistress of a storybook castle, and increasingly alone inside it. A husband who drifted, a mind still burning with everything her father had cultivated, and her husband found faintly annoying, with nowhere at all to put it. She was a woman built to rule, sitting idle by the sea, and she was hungry for something real to do, something worthy of everything she was. That hunger was the most dangerous thing about her. It was also the most human. Any of us, given a great gift and no room to use it, might reach for the first door that opens. The door, when it opened, came from across an ocean. Mexican monarchists, backed by Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, had a proposition. Far away, in a country torn by civil war, there was a throne going begging. They wanted a European prince to sit on it. They wanted Maximilian. He hesitated. He was a hesitator by nature, and he saw every reason it might end badly. This is the part that would haunt Charlotte to the edge of her sanity and beyond, so let's be exact about it. It wasn't Maximilian who overcame his own doubts. It was Charlotte. She was the one who saw the crown and wanted it. For him, for herself, for the great and meaningful destiny she'd always believed the two of them were owed. She was the one who argued, encouraged, pushed. The little girl who'd turned down a Portuguese king because crowns were heavy burdens had grown into a woman who couldn't resist the heaviest crown of all. They said yes. They would cross the sea and become Emperor and Empress of Mexico. Somewhere in the years that followed, in a hotel room in Rome, screaming that assassins were at the door, she would begin to understand what she'd reached for. But that was still ahead of her. For now, there was only the thrill of it. A real empire, a real purpose, the whole of her formidable self, finally with somewhere to go. The sea castle emptied. The trunks were packed. And behind them, as they sailed, another door swung shut on the quiet life they might have kept, the last safe one they would ever have. They landed at Veracruz on a hot day in May 1864, expecting a nation. What met them was silence. Veracruz was a liberal town, and it didn't want them. The streets that should have been thick with cheering crowds were thin and cool. The welcome that should have been a coronation's worth of noise was barely a murmur. Riding through those near-empty streets beside her husband, Charlotte is said to have come close to weeping. It wasn't the arrival she'd crossed an ocean to have. It was, though, an honest preview. She simply couldn't read it yet. Because here's what the recruiters in Paris hadn't told them, what Napoleon III, who wanted a French empire in the Americas, had been careful to blur. There had supposedly been a vote, a great national welcome, a people crying out for a European prince. It was a fiction. The country they'd been handed wasn't waiting for a king. It was a nation in the middle of a civil war, with a Republican president named Benito Juarez, who had no intention of stepping aside, and a great many people who saw the new emperor and empress not as saviors, but as foreigners arriving on the points of French bayonets. Maximilian and Charlotte didn't fully understand that at first, and it would be easy to make them villains or fools. The truth is gentler and sadder than either. They came with real ideals. They believed genuinely and naively that they could do good. And of the two of them, it was Charlotte who came closest to actually doing it. This is the part of her story that gets lost, buried under everything that came after. And it deserves to be pulled back into the light. For a brief window in Mexico City, Charlotte wasn't a decorative empress. She was, in every way that mattered, a working head of state. They made their home in Chapultepec Castle on a hill above the capital, and from there she governed. When Maximilian traveled, and he traveled often, restless as ever, he left the government in her hands. She sat as regent. She read the papers, signed the decrees, held the audiences. She pushed for better conditions for agricultural workers. She took a real and unusual interest in the indigenous people of Mexico, in a century when almost no one in her position bothered to. The claim that she was among the first women to exercise real political rule on the American continent is broad and depends heavily on how rule is defined. Listen to her own diagnosis of why the governments before them had failed, because it's sharp and clear-eyed and entirely her own. They have never had any root in the Indian population, which is the only one that works and enables the state to live. That isn't the sentence of a pampered ornament. That's the sentence of a mind that understood. Better than her husband. Better than the Frenchman who'd sent them there. Where the real ground of a country lay. Give her a different century, and you can imagine what that intelligence might have built. But she didn't have a different century. She had this one, and this one was closing in faster than either of them could see. The empire was hollow from the start, and it began to cave almost as soon as it was raised. The Republican forces wouldn't be beaten. The war ground on, expensive and unwinnable. The conservative Mexicans who'd invited Maximilian turned on him when he refused to undo the liberal reforms they wanted, reversed. He was, in the end, too decent for the people who'd summoned him, and too foreign for everyone else. They even mocked her in song, a satirical little tune, sung to a mocking lilt. Adios, Mama Carlota. Goodbye, Mother Carlota. It followed the imperial cause like a jeer, a farewell melody set to her name before she'd even gone. Then came the blow that finished everything. Far away in Europe, Napoleon III, the man who'd lured them onto this throne, who'd promised soldiers and support, did the arithmetic. The United States, its own civil war finished, was leaning hard on France to get out of Mexico. Prussia was rising at his back in Europe. Mexico had become too expensive, too dangerous, too much. So Napoleon did what men like Napoleon always do when the account stops balancing. He withdrew. The French troops, the only thing holding Maximilian's empire upright, began to pack up and sail home. It was a death sentence, and everyone with eyes could see it. Without French soldiers, the empire had months to live. Maximilian's advisors urged him to abdicate, to leave while the sea lanes were still open. Even Napoleon, shamefaced, urged him to go. Maximilian wouldn't. And Charlotte, who'd pushed him toward this crown, who carried that knowledge in her like a stone, couldn't simply stand and watch it all collapse. She wasn't built to sit and wait for the end. She'd never been. So she made a decision that was brave and desperate, and, though she couldn't have known it, the beginning of the end of her mind. She'd go back to Europe herself, cross the ocean the other way, and stand in front of Napoleon III and the Pope himself, if she had to, and make them help. She boarded the ship in the summer of 1866. She was 26 years old. In every photograph from that year, she's still composed, regal, formidably sane. She was sailing straight toward the hour her mind would break. And she was sailing there to save the man she loved. She would never see Mexico or Maximilian again. She reached France in August and went to Napoleon first. He wouldn't see her at first. When at last he did, he wept, pleaded illness, and gave her nothing. She came back. She pressed harder, laid out the case with all the force of that formidable mind, and watched it break against a wall of French politeness and French excuses. The emperor who'd lured her husband onto a throne on the far side of the world wouldn't lift one finger to keep him there. Something in her began to give way. You can see it if you follow the accounts of those weeks, like a fracture spreading across glass. The composure she'd worn her whole life began, very quietly, to come apart. She grew suspicious. She grew frightened. She started to believe Napoleon didn't merely want to abandon her. She started to believe he wanted her dead. From Paris, she went south to Rome, to the one power left who might help her, the Pope. It was there, over a handful of autumn days, that the fracture became a shattering. She stopped eating. She stopped drinking. She'd become convinced there was poison everywhere, in the food, in the water, in the hands of anyone who came near. She refused all of it, growing weaker and wilder by the hour. At one point, desperate with a thirst she wouldn't otherwise quench, she asked to be taken to the Trevi fountain so she could drink from the running water with her own cupped hands. Because the fountain, at least, couldn't have been poisoned. Let that image sit for a moment. An empress, a woman who'd signed the laws of a nation, kneeling at a public fountain in Rome, drinking from her hands like a hunted animal, because she trusted no cup offered to her. On the 1st of October, she went to the Vatican for a final audience with Pope Pius IX. She arrived in mourning black, her eyes sunken, her cheeks burning. She wept and couldn't be calmed. When the time came to leave, she refused, clinging to the Pope, begging to stay the night inside the Vatican walls, certain the assassins Napoleon had sent were waiting for her in the streets outside. It's said she became the only woman ever to spend a night within the papal apartments, not as an honor, but as a woman too terrified to walk out the door. Her brother came for her. On the 9th of October, doctors examined her and gave their verdict in the cold language of the age: madness, with fixed ideas of persecution. I want to stop here, because this is the moment a cheaper version of this story reaches for a tidy diagnosis, and I'm not going to do that. For more than a century, people have argued over what broke Charlotte's mind. Grief and terror alone, some said. A hereditary weakness in the blood, said others. Some whispered darker things. Poison, illness, causes so lurid they belong to legend rather than history. The honest answer is that no one ever established the cause, and no one ever will. The woman is gone. The truth went with her. What we can say is gentler, sadder, and true. A brilliant, controlled, deeply devout woman had spent her whole life holding herself together by sheer will. Through a mother's death, a father's distance, a husband's coldness, a childless marriage, an empire crumbling around her. Then, in a hotel room far from home, with the last door of hope closing in her face, the will finally failed. She had carried everything, and no one can carry everything forever. They took her to Miramare, the white castle by the sea she'd built with Maximilian in their hopeful years, when the future still looked like a fairy tale. But she didn't return to it as its mistress. She returned as a patient, kept in the guest house on the grounds, watched by guards, attended by doctors, held for month after month in a soft and total captivity. 9 months in a castle she'd once called home, treated as a prisoner in all but name. And here is where the story turns from tragedy into something almost unbearable to tell. Because while Charlotte was shut in that seaside castle, losing her grip on the world, her husband, an ocean away, was running out of time. The empire she'd sailed to save was in its final collapse. Maximilian had refused to flee, and the people around Charlotte, watching her fragile mind, made a decision. A well-meant decision. A merciful decision, they told themselves. She must not be told. Whatever was about to happen to Maximilian in Mexico, and they could all guess what was coming, Charlotte in her state couldn't be allowed to know it. Her family, her doctors, her keepers, closed ranks around a single careful silence. And into that silence, to move her, to manage her, to keep her calm and compliant. They would eventually do a thing so quietly cruel, it's hard to say aloud. They would put words in the mouth of a dead man. In the last days, it came down to a telegram. They needed to move her out of Miramare, back to Belgium, into her family's care. But Charlotte, in those months, was suspicious of everything. Certain unseen hands were reaching for her. She wouldn't simply be led. She had to be persuaded. And there was only one name left in the world she still trusted without question. So they used it. A message was placed in her hands. On it was the one signature that could still move her. Maximilian, it said, wished her to return to Brussels, to her brother's house. And Charlotte, who'd crossed an ocean twice for this man, who'd begged an emperor and clung to a pope for him, did the only thing she'd ever done where he was concerned. She obeyed. She went home because she believed he'd asked her to. He'd asked her nothing. The hand that wrote that message wasn't his. By the time it reached her, he was a prisoner in a doomed city with almost no days left to live. They had reached into a marriage and forged the voice of the man at its center, and used her love for him to steer her like a child. It may have been mercy. The people who did it surely told themselves it was. But there's something in it that never stops aching. That the last instruction Charlotte ever received from her husband was a lie written by someone else, and that she followed it faithfully all the way home. And in Mexico, the thing they were all bracing for arrived. Maximilian wouldn't run. Offered the chance to shave his beard and slip through enemy lines in disguise, he refused. He wouldn't undignify himself, he said, not even to live. The city of Querétaro fell. He was captured, tried by the republic he'd tried to displace, and sentenced to death. The crowned heads of Europe sent their pleas. Even voices with every reason to want him gone asked that his life be spared. Benito Juárez refused them all. The law would run its course. On the morning of the 19th of June, 1867, they led him out to a low hill outside the city, Cerro de las Campanas, the Hill of the Bells. 2 of his generals walked with him, condemned beside him. The dawn was clear. He met it with a composure that surprised everyone who saw it. He gave each soldier in the firing squad a gold coin and made one small human request, that they not fire at his face so that his mother, far away in Vienna, might still recognize him. Then he spoke in Spanish, in a clear and steady voice, his last words to a country that had never wanted him. I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood, which is about to be shed, be for the good of a country. Viva Mexico! Viva la Independencia! The Valle came, and the Emperor of Mexico, the Archduke who'd crossed an ocean for a crown, the dreamer his brilliant wife had pushed toward greatness, fell dead against an adobe wall in the early light. An ocean away, Charlotte didn't know. She wouldn't be told, not for a long time. When his body was finally returned to Europe months later, some understanding of it seems to have reached her. But by then, the woman who could fully receive such news was already gone. The person who'd loved him was still there. The mind that could hold his death was not. And this is where her story becomes something stranger and more tender than a simple tragedy. Because here's the part that, once you know it, you can't put down. For the next 60 years, Charlotte lived on. And in her worst spells, the spells that would come and go for the rest of her life, she could be seized by a terrible, destroying rage. She'd sweep the crystal from the tables and shatter it. She'd tear pictures from the walls. She'd rip her own beloved books apart with her hands. Whole rooms would be wrecked in the fury of a mind at war with itself. But in all those years, through all those rages, there was one thing she never touched. Anything that had belonged to Maximilian, any object he'd held, any gift he'd given, any relic of the life they'd shared. Those she left untouched. She gathered them, kept them, guarded them, and built around them something close to a shrine. The hands that destroyed everything else in blind fury went gentle the instant they came near his things. Think about what that means. Her reason had failed. Her grip on the world had failed. The doctors had a cold word for what she'd become. But underneath all of it, beneath the ruin of that formidable mind, something had survived that the madness couldn't reach. The love was still there, intact, whole, steadier than her sanity, steadier than her memory, steadier than the truth they'd hidden from her. They took the empire. They took the husband. They took, in the end, her mind itself. They never managed to take the one thing she'd crossed an ocean for. Now and then, in fragments, it would surface. In long, disjointed monologues with people who weren't there. In languages she slipped between as she talked to the empty air. One of the women who cared for her wrote down a piece of it once, a broken murmur out of that lost interior world. "Sir, one was told that one had had a husband, sir, and then madness. Madness is made of events. If only he had been helped by Napoleon. Madness is made of events. Even in the wreckage, some part of her understood exactly what had happened to her. She'd been given a husband and then given events no one could survive. She hadn't survived them whole, but she'd survived them loving him, which may be the only mercy in the whole of her story. And it was a mercy no one gave her. She kept it herself. She came home to Belgium, and the world put her away. Not cruelly at first, gently even. A castle was found for her. Bouchou, an old moated fortress north of Brussels. There, from 1879 onward, she'd live out the rest of her days. Her brother, now King Leopold II, held the keys to her care. She had rooms and servants and gardens to walk in. She wanted for nothing money could buy. She wanted only the one thing money couldn't. So the years began to pass, and there were so very many of them. Charlotte outlived her husband by 60 years. She was 26 when the last door closed behind her at Miramare. She'd be 86 when she died. In between lay a stretch of time so long it's hard to hold in the mind. The world she'd known, emperors, archdukes, horse-drawn state visits, simply ended around her while she sat inside it, unchanged. The telephone was invented. The motor car came. Men learned to fly. Whole dynasties rose and fell and rose again. And through all of it, in a quiet castle in Belgium, an old empress went on, reigning over a country that no longer existed, in a marriage to a man decades dead. Her days were small and gentle when the rages left her be. She walked in the gardens. She embroidered. She played cards and listened to her gramophone and let a painter come to sketch the horses she loved. She was driven through the grounds in a carriage under a parasol, an old woman in a park, and to anyone watching, she might have been any widow of good family, seeing out her years. Then the fits would come, and the crockery would fly, and the servants would remember what she was. There's one stretch near the end when even history's great machinery came grinding to her door and couldn't touch her. In 1914, the Great War broke over Europe, and the German army poured across Belgium, occupying nearly all of it. Not Bouchou. Charlotte was still, legally, an Archduchess of Austria, sister-in-law to an emperor allied with Germany. Her castle was declared untouchable. She had them fly the Austro-Hungarian flag from the roof. Picture it. A country under occupation, a continent tearing itself apart in the trenches, and above one quiet Belgian castle, the black and gold flag of a fading empire, flown by a woman most of the world had long since assumed was dead. In 1916, a puzzled German officer actually came to ask why the colors of Austria were flying over occupied Belgium. The answer was an old woman upstairs who'd once been an empress and whom the war itself had agreed to leave alone. There's one more turn of the knife, and it belongs in her story, so we won't soften it. Charlotte had been one of the richest women in Europe, the fortune of a Belgian king's only daughter. She was in no state to manage it, so her brother Leopold managed it for her. And Leopold II used a great deal of his sister's money to fund the one enterprise his name is now bound to forever: his private colonial venture in the Congo, a place that would become a byword for suffering on a scale almost beyond counting. So the fortune of a woman locked away for her own protection helped pay for one of history's great cruelties, carried out in her family's name, while she sat in her castle and knew nothing of it. She couldn't save herself. She certainly couldn't save anyone else. Her money went out into the world and did terrible things, and she embroidered and walked in the garden and waited. And still, through all of it, the love held. It never left her. In her lucid hours when the fog thinned, it was Maximilian she returned to. Always. She kept his things around her like relics, and once, in a moment of terrible clarity, she wrote of him with a tenderness the years and the illness hadn't touched. I find a sad satisfaction in the tributes and the admiration that surround his memory, but which make me weep again with each new proof I find in such beautiful words. 40 years a widow, 50, and still weeping at kind words written about a man long gone. The mind had failed. The love had not. It said she kept a doll she called by his name and slept beside it. Whether or not that's exactly so, the truth beneath it isn't in doubt. To the very end, in whatever country her mind had gone to live in, she was still his wife, and he was still coming home. On the 19th of January, 1927, an influenza settled into her chest and turned to pneumonia. Charlotte of Belgium, Carlota, Empress of Mexico, died at last in her castle at 86. 3 days later, they carried her to the royal crypt at Laeken. It was snowing hard, and her coffin was borne by 6 old men, the last survivors of the Belgian Legion that had sailed to Mexico with her and her husband more than 60 years before. 6 aging soldiers of a vanished empire carrying their empress through the snow to lay her down at the end of the longest widowhood anyone could remember. She'd been raised to rule, and she ruled for 3 years. She'd crossed an ocean for a crown and lost it, and lost her husband, and lost her reason, and lived on for 60 years in the wreckage. But she held, at the very end, onto the one thing they never managed to take from her. They forged her husband's hand and used it to move her. They hid his death and let her wander toward it in the dark. They put her behind the walls of a castle and let the century pass her by. They never took the love. It was steadier than the empire, steadier than her mind, steadier than the truth itself. She carried it whole and untouched through 60 silent years, the one crown no one could take off her head. There was no door left to close. There was only Charlotte at last, going home. This has been Crown Secrets and Scandals. If her story stayed with you, there are so many more of these women waiting to be told. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.